I used to believe that serving your country meant you'd always have people's respect. 22 years in military finance taught me discipline, strategy, and prudence. What it didn't prepare me for was discovering that the people closest to you often see your kindness as a resource to be depleted. The realization burned in my chest like forgotten shrapnel, sharp, persistent, and impossible to ignore once you feel it. When my son-in-law Brandon relocated my bathroom essentials to the unfinished basement, claiming the upstairs bathroom needed to be guest-ready for his business associates, I didn't argue. Not then. I simply took note, like I would during a tactical assessment. 3 months later, when I called the board meeting at Eastern Seaboard Mortgage Holdings and revealed I was the anonymous majority shareholder of the very company financing his overpriced Colonial, the look on his face made those 3 months of humiliation entirely worth it. People often mistake patience for weakness. They shouldn't. My name is Colonel Margaret Maggie Sullivan, retired. After a distinguished career managing billion-dollar defense budgets and orchestrating financial operations across 3 continents, I returned to civilian life with a pension, substantial investments, and a strategic mind that never quite turned off. My late husband Robert, who passed 5 years ago, always said I could squeeze blood from the financial markets and turn crisis into opportunity. During the housing crash of 2008, while others panicked, I methodically acquired distressed mortgage assets when nobody wanted them. By 2012, those toxic investments had quadrupled in value. I kept that information to myself. The military teaches you to keep your capabilities close to your chest. In combat zones, I'd seen how flaunting resources made you a target. In peacetime, I applied the same principle to wealth. I lived modestly in a comfortable but unassuming 2-bedroom ranch house in Meadowbrook, drove a sensible Volvo station wagon that was already 7 years old, and dressed in practical clothing from mid-range department stores. My daughter Jessica often joked that I was the only millionaire who shopped with coupons. "Mom, why are you counting pennies when you have thousands in the bank?" she'd ask while rolling her eyes, completely unaware that thousands was a significant underestimation. "Because discipline doesn't take vacations," I'd respond, the same answer I'd given since she was old enough to ask for designer jeans in middle school. The truth was, I enjoyed the simplicity. After years of deployment stress and responsibility for enormous sums of taxpayer money, there was peace in modest living. The ranch house had enough room for me, my books, and my garden. The car got me where I needed to go. The clothes kept me warm and presentable. What more did I need? Flashiness had never impressed me, but stability and security did. Jessica had always been different. Where I saw value in restraint, she sought validation in appearances. As a child, she'd beg for the trendiest toys, regardless of quality or longevity. As a teenager, she prioritized brands over durability. And as an adult, she married Brandon Miller, a man whose financial philosophy could be summarized as borrow to impress. I tried to guide her gently over the years. When she was 16 and wanted a $200 pair of jeans, I offered her $80 for a quality pair and suggested she earn the difference. When she was 22 and maxed out her first credit card, on spring break, I helped her create a repayment plan rather than bailing her out. Small lessons that I hoped would eventually take root. But some lessons, it seemed, needed to be learned the hard way. Brandon entered our lives during Jessica's senior year of college. Tall, conventionally handsome, with carefully styled hair, and an excessive collection of designer watches, he radiated a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was already working at a commercial real estate firm and drove a leased BMW that cost more monthly than my mortgage. His family came from old New England money that had apparently dwindled over generations, leaving him with the expectations and tastes of wealth without the actual inheritance to match it. The first time he came to dinner at my home, he scanned the modest surroundings with poorly disguised disappointment. "Cozy place you've got here, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, emphasizing cozy in a way that clearly meant small. "Thank you. It suits me perfectly," I replied evenly, noticing how Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside him. Throughout dinner, Brandon spoke at length about his ambitions, the corner office he expected within 5 years, the vacation home in the Hamptons he planned to acquire, the connections he was building with the right kind of people. Jessica watched him with admiration. That concerned me, but I kept my observations to myself. My daughter was 21, old enough to make her own decisions, even if they weren't the ones I would have made. After dessert, while Jessica cleared the plates, Brandon leaned across the table confidentially. Between us, Mrs. Sullivan, I think. Jess has real potential, but she needs some polishing. Those state school connections won't get her far in the circles we'll be moving in. I studied him carefully, taking in the expensive watch, the custom-tailored shirt, and the casual presumption that I would agree with his assessment of my daughter's deficiencies. Jessica graduated with honors and 0 student debt, I said calmly. I consider that extraordinary potential already realized. Brandon's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, education is important, but in our world, it's who you know, not just what you know. And what world is that exactly? I asked, genuinely curious about how he saw himself. The world where decisions get made, Mrs. Sullivan. The real world. I nodded slowly, thinking of the war zone financial offices where I'd made resource allocations that affected thousands of lives, of the tense budget negotiations with defense contractors and foreign governments, of the real consequences of miscalculations in my line of work. I'm quite familiar with that world, Brandon, though I suspect we might define it differently. Before he could respond, Jessica returned, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But that exchange revealed everything I needed to know about Brandon Miller. He was a man who measured worth in brand names and square footage, who saw relationships as transactions, and who fundamentally misunderstood the difference between appearance and substance. When Jessica announced their engagement 6 months later, I congratulated them both and offered to help with a modest wedding. Brandon immediately began talking about a destination ceremony in Santorini, with chartered jets for the wedding party. "We'll need to think bigger, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, patting my hand condescendingly. "This will be the social event of the season. Many of my clients will be attending." "I see," I replied. "And what's your budget for this social event?" Brandon laughed as if I'd said something charmingly naive. "You don't budget art, Mrs. Sullivan. You invest in it." I turned to Jessica. "And you're comfortable with this plan?" She glanced at Brandon, then back to me, her expression caught between excitement and anxiety. "It sounds amazing, doesn't it? Brandon says his firm might even sponsor part of it since so many business connections will be there." I recognized the expression on my daughter's face. It was the same one she'd worn at 12 when begging for an expensive bike she couldn't quite ride yet, and at 16 when pleading for permission to attend an unchaperoned party, hopeful but uncertain, wanting to believe everything would be perfect despite evidence to the contrary. "That sounds like a significant commitment," I said carefully. "Perhaps we should discuss the details when you have more concrete numbers." Brandon's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Absolutely. We'll get you all the details once we've secured the venue. These exclusive locations book up years in advance, so we'll need to move quickly." In the end, reality intervened before Brandon's Santorini fantasy could materialize. His firm underwent restructuring, his promised promotion was delayed, and suddenly a domestic wedding seemed more authentic and meaningfully intimate. Jessica seemed relieved, though she would never admit it, and I quietly arranged for a beautiful ceremony at the Meadowbrook Botanical Gardens, where Robert and I had often walked on Sunday mornings. The wedding was lovely, tasteful, and paid for in full, no small feat given Brandon's continued attempts to upgrade every element from the chairs to the champagne. When he discovered I had military connections that entitled us to a discount on the venue, his enthusiasm dampened noticeably. Image, it seemed, mattered more than value. "Won't people think it's a bit budget?" he asked Jessica within my earshot. The gardens are beautiful, Jessica defended. Mom says the spring blossoms will be perfect for photos. Sure, but wouldn't the Grand Meridian Hotel make a stronger statement? About what? I interjected, unable to contain myself. About your credit limit? Brandon's jaw tightened. About our standards, Mrs. Sullivan. The people attending this wedding have certain expectations. Then perhaps they should host their own weddings at the Grand Meridian, I suggested pleasantly. This one happens to be in a botanical garden. Jessica quickly changed the subject, a peacekeeping skill she'd perfected growing up in a military household where directness was valued. Later, she pulled me aside. Mom, please don't antagonize Brandon. His job is really stressful right now, and appearances matter in his industry. I took her hands in mine. Sweetheart, I understand professional pressure, but starting a marriage with financial strain for the sake of appearances isn't wise, Jessica sighed. It's not strain to him, Mom. It's investment. Brandon says you have a scarcity mindset because of how you grew up. He says once you've experienced real abundance, you understand money differently. The comment stung, not because it contained any truth, but because it revealed how thoroughly Brandon had influenced my daughter's perception of me. In Jessica's eyes, I had become the unsophisticated parent who simply didn't understand how the modern world worked. My decades of financial expertise had been dismissed as outdated thinking by a young man whose primary financial strategy appeared to be leveraging debt for lifestyle inflation. But parenting adult children requires restraint. I swallowed my defense and simply said, everyone has their own relationship with money, just make sure yours is healthy. The early years of their marriage followed a predictable pattern. Brandon and Jessica bought a house well beyond their means in an exclusive neighborhood, ABI, sprawling colonial with more bathrooms than people to use them. They leased luxury vehicles, took extravagant vacations documented meticulously on social media, and gradually accumulated the trappings of wealth without the foundation to support it. I kept my concerns to myself, offering help only when directly asked. When they needed a temporary loan to cover an unexpected property tax increase, I provided it with clear repayment terms. When Jessica called, stressed about Brandon's spending on golf club memberships while their credit card debt mounted, I listened without judgment and gently suggested financial counseling. He'd never agree to that, Jessica said, her voice lowered as if he might overhear from across town. He says our cash flow issue is temporary. His commission structure is changing next quarter, and everything will be fine once the big deal's close. I recognize the language of perpetual deferral. Next quarter, next bonus, next promotion. The horizon of financial stability was always visible, but never reached. And if those deals don't close? I asked gently. They will, Jessica insisted. Brandon says the market is about to explode. Everyone at his level is positioned for massive growth. The conviction in her voice reminded me of investment officers I'd known who couldn't distinguish between strategy and hope. I changed tactics. How are you, Jess? Not the finances. You. Are you happy? The line went quiet for a moment. I'm fine, Mom. Just tired. Brandon's been working late a lot, and you know how I get when I don't sleep well. I did know. My methodical, thoughtful daughter became forgetful and anxious when exhausted. It had been true since she was a child. Why don't you come over this weekend? I'll make that lemon chicken you like. We can catch up properly. Jessica hesitated. I'd need to check. With Brandon. We might have a thing with his colleagues. The invitation stands, even if it's just for an hour. She did come that weekend, arriving in a new Range Rover that still had temporary tags. She looked thinner than the last time I'd seen her, and there was a tightness around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. Over lunch, she spoke almost exclusively about Brandon's work, his stress, his ambitions. Her own part-time job at an art gallery, once a passion, barely warranted a mention. When I asked about her painting, a talent she'd cultivated since childhood, she waved dismissively. I don't really have time for hobbies anymore. Between maintaining the house and supporting Brandon's career, my schedule is packed. Supporting his career doesn't mean surrendering yours, I pointed out. Jessica's expression hardened in a way that reminded me painfully of her new husband. It's not surrendering, Mom. It's prioritizing. Brandon's on track for regional director. That's a 6-figure position with equity options. And what are you on track for? I asked. We're a team, she replied, the answer practiced and prompt. His success is our success. I nodded, recognizing the futility of pushing further. Jessica had made her choice, and she needed my support, not my criticism. Still, as she prepared to leave, I couldn't help one last attempt. You know you can always come to me, Jess. For anything, no questions asked. She hugged me, a quick, perfunctory embrace. I know, Mom, but everything's fine. Better than fine. You'll see. I watched the Range Rover disappear down the street, my chest tight with familiar worry. In war zones, I'd learned to recognize when things appeared too calm, too orderly. The surface tranquility often masked underlying instability. Jessica's life had the same artificial smoothness, a veneer of success concealing troubling structural weaknesses. This pattern continued for nearly 3 years. Jessica's visits became less frequent, her calls more superficial. Brandon's career supposedly flourished, yet they always seemed to be navigating some temporary financial challenge. They refinanced the Colonial twice in 30 months. The Range. Rover was traded for an even more expensive German SUV. Brandon's collection of watches expanded, each one representing months of mortgage payments, and then came the call that would ultimately change everything. Mom. Jessica's voice was tight, controlled. Brandon and I were wondering if you've thought more about downsizing. Downsizing? I repeated, genuinely confused. Your house. It's really too big for just one person, and you're not getting any. Younger. We've been talking, and we think it makes sense for you to consider moving into something more manageable. I looked around my modest ranch house with its 2 bedrooms and single story. Jessica, this house is already quite manageable. But the maintenance, Mom, the yard work, the cleaning, it must be overwhelming. I have a service that helps with the heavy lifting once a month, I said. The rest keeps me active. Jessica sighed, the sound familiar and disappointing. Brandon says at your age, you should be thinking about a retirement community, somewhere with people your own age and activities designed for seniors. I was 56. I appreciate the concern, I said evenly, but I'm quite happy where I am. Well, Jessica continued, her voice taking on the artificial brightness that signaled an agenda. What if you had family nearby? Wouldn't that be nice? And there it was, the real purpose of the call. Are you moving to Meadowbrook? I asked, already knowing the answer. Not exactly. But we were thinking, your house has that separate entrance to the finished basement. It would make a perfect in-law suite. You could live downstairs and we'd take the main floor. It would be perfect. I sat down slowly, processing the breathtaking presumption of the proposal. They weren't suggesting I move in with them. They were suggesting they move in with me, relegating me to the basement of my own home. And what would happen to your Colonial? I asked, keeping my tone neutral through decades of practiced discipline. We'd sell it, of course. The market's perfect right now, and Brandon says we could use the equity to really transform your place. Update the kitchen, redo the bathrooms, maybe add a sunroom, turn it into a real showpiece, transform my place, as if my home of 15 years was merely raw material awaiting their vision, as if my preferences, my comfort, my ownership were incidental. I see, I said, measuring my words carefully. And has Brandon considered how this move might affect his commute? His office is nearly an hour from Meadowbrook in good traffic. Jessica hesitated. Well, that's the other thing. Brandon's been offered an amazing opportunity with a new firm. It would mean a bit of a career reset, but the potential is huge. Translation: Brandon had lost his job or was about to. The supposed financial stability they'd been projecting was collapsing, and they needed a safety net. My home, my space, my resources. I'd need time to consider such a significant change, I said finally. Let me think about it and we can discuss it when you're next in town. Great. Jessica's relief was palpable. We'll come this weekend. Brandon has some design ideas already. He says with the right renovations, we could increase your property value by 30%. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the afternoon light play across the butcher block countertops Robert had installed before his health began to fail. This was not just my house. It was our last project together. The place where we'd planned to grow old side by side before cancer intervened. Every corner held memories, the slight unevenness in the hallway floor that always made Robert joke about his amateur carpentry skills, the built-in bookshelves that perfectly fit my military history collection, the back garden where I grew tomatoes and basil each summer. And now Brandon wanted to transform it, to relegate me to the basement while they took over the home I'd made. The presumption was staggering, yet somehow unsurprising given everything I'd observed about my son-in-law over the years. I poured myself a small measure of Robert's favorite bourbon, a ritual I reserved for major decisions, and considered my options. As I sipped the amber liquid, feeling its familiar warmth, a plan began to take shape. Not an emotional reaction, but a strategic response. Brandon had always underestimated me, dismissed my financial acumen as outdated frugality, misread my restraint as limitation. Perhaps it was time he learned what a career in military finance actually entailed. Perhaps it was time to reveal the resources I'd kept carefully concealed. I opened my laptop and logged into an account I rarely accessed, one that contained information about my more significant investments. Among them was my controlling interest in Eastern Seaboard mortgage holdings, acquired gradually during the market collapse when institutional investors were desperate to offload toxic assets. A few clicks revealed what I already suspected. Brandon and Jessica's Colonial was financed through a subsidiary of Eastern Seaboard. Their recent refinancing had likely stretched them to the absolute limit of qualification. And with Brandon's employment situation changing, they were almost certainly heading toward default. I took another sip of bourbon, feeling a strange calm settle over me. The tactical part of my brain, the one that had managed complex logistical operations under extreme pressure, began methodically arranging pieces on the board. Brandon and Jessica would arrive this weekend with their renovation, plans and presumptions. They expected to find a lonely widow grateful for their company, eager to surrender her space in exchange for their presence. They would find something quite different. I spent the days before their arrival methodically preparing, much as I had, before complex financial operations during my military career. On Thursday morning, I called Thomas Harrington, my longtime attorney and friend from our days at West Point. Maggie. His voice brightened when he realized it was me. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? I need some documents prepared. Tom, I said, keeping my tone even. And I'd appreciate your discretion. You've had it for 30 years, he replied, instantly serious. What's happening? I explained the situation concisely. Jessica and Brandon's financial difficulties, their proposal to move into my home, and my suspicions about Brandon's employment status. Ah, Tom said when I finished. The vultures circle when they smell. Vulnerability. Precisely. And I'd like to be prepared for various contingencies. What do you have in mind? I outlined my plan, including my controlling interest in Eastern Seaboard mortgage holdings and the documents I would need to protect my assets while maintaining leverage. That's quite thorough, Tom said when I finished. Reminds me of that operation in Kabul when the local contractors tried to double bill the Pentagon. I learned from that experience, I replied. Better to have options you don't need than to need options you don't have. Tom agreed to have everything ready by Friday afternoon. And Maggie, he added before hanging up. For what it's worth, I think Robert would approve of this approach. He never did tolerate opportunists. After the call, I walked through my house with a notepad, documenting the condition of every room with photographs. The kitchen with its solid maple cabinets and butcher block countertops, the living room with built-in bookshelves and the stone fireplace Robert had insisted on despite the contractor's objections. The master bedroom with its views of the garden and the ensuite bathroom we'd renovated just before his diagnosis. Each space held memories of the life we'd built. Practical, comfortable, paid for in full. Nothing extravagant, but nothing lacking, either. The opposite of Brandon and Jessica's colonial with its hollow grandeur and precarious financing. I stopped in the basement, which Brandon apparently envisioned as my future living quarters. It was finished, certainly. Robert had done the work himself over several summers, but it was clearly a basement. The ceiling was lower, the windows smaller and higher on the walls. There was a small bathroom with a standard shower stall, spare bedroom we'd used for storage, and an open area with a television and some exercise equipment. Could I live here if necessary? Of course. I'd lived in military barracks and field tents under far worse conditions. But would I choose to be relegated to the basement of my own home, while my daughter and her financially irresponsible husband took over the main living space? Absolutely not. On Friday, as promised, Tom delivered a leather portfolio containing the documents I'd requested, verification of my ownership stake in Eastern Seaboard Mortgage Holdings, a detailed assessment of Brandon and Jessica's mortgage situation, which was even worse than I'd suspected, and several other legal instruments that would give me options depending on how the weekend unfolded. Everything's in order, Tom assured me, though I hope you won't need most of it. As do I replied, tucking the portfolio into my home safe. But hope is not a strategy. Tom's expression softened slightly. How are you feeling about all this, Maggie? Really? The question caught me off guard. Military leadership and widowhood had both trained me to compartmentalize emotions, to focus on objectives rather than feelings. But Tom had known me since before those habits formed, back when we were ambitious cadets with more idealism than experience. Disappointed, I admitted finally. In Brandon, certainly, but more so in Jessica. I thought I'd raised her to see through this kind of superficial nonsense. Tom nodded slowly. Children make their own choices. Sometimes the hardest part of parenting is allowing them to face the consequences. Even when those consequences might hurt them? Especially then, he said gently. Because those are the lessons that actually stick. After Tom left, I spent the evening reviewing the documents, refining my approach, considering contingencies. Jessica had texted that they would arrive around noon on Saturday. That gave me the morning to make final preparations. I slept poorly that night, my mind cycling through scenarios, tactics, potential responses. This wasn't the retirement I had envisioned. Strategic maneuvering against my own son-in-law to protect my home and assets. But as Robert used to say, you play the hand you're dealt, not the one you wish you had. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. I rose early, completed my usual routine, stretching exercises to keep my shoulder mobility after an old injury, a light breakfast, 30 minutes with my current book. Then I dressed carefully in what Robert had called my command presence outfit, tailored charcoal slacks, a crisp white button-down, and a navy blazer with subtle gold buttons. Professional without being intimidating, authoritative without being severe. At precisely 12:15, Jessica's Range Rover pulled into my driveway. I watched through the living room window as she emerged from the passenger side, looking exhausted despite careful makeup. Brandon stepped out from behind the wheel, checking his reflection in the car window before straightening his designer polo shirt. I opened the front door before they reached it, greeting them with a neutral smile. Right on time. Come in. Jessica hugged me, A quick, distracted embrace. Mom, you look nice. Are you going somewhere later? No plans to leave, I replied, leading them into the living room. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? Brandon declined with a wave of his hand, already scanning the room with the calculating gaze of someone mentally rearranging furniture. We can't stay long. We've got a meeting with a contractor at 3 to discuss some renovation ideas. For here? I asked, my tone deliberately mild. Potentially? He hedged, exchanging a glance with Jessica. We've been thinking about your situation, Maggie. That's actually why we wanted to talk today. My situation. As if my stable, mortgage-free lifestyle represented a problem in need of their solution. Please, sit, I said, gesturing to the sofa. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Jessica perched on the edge of the cushion, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Brandon settled beside her with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. So, Jessica mentioned our idea about the living arrangements, he began, using the smooth, practiced tone I imagined he used with clients. I've been looking at the potential here, and I think with some strategic updates, we could really maximize your property value while creating a multi-generational living solution. Multi-generational, I repeated. That's an interesting term for suggesting I move into my basement. Brandon's smile flickered momentarily. Well, we wouldn't put it quite that way. The lower level would be your private suite, independent living with the security of having family just upstairs. And what about my current living space? The main floor of the home I own outright? That would be the family area, Brandon said, his confidence returning. Common spaces we would all share, plus the bedrooms for Jessica and me, and eventually, children. I nodded slowly, processing the breathtaking presumption of his proposal. In Brandon's vision, I would surrender approximately 75% of my living space to accommodate their lifestyle, retaining only the basement as my private suite. I see. And this contractor you're meeting today, they would be implementing these changes? Exactly. Brandon's enthusiasm grew as he misinterpreted my questions as interest. I'm thinking we open up the kitchen to the living area, maybe add an island. The master bathroom definitely needs updating. Those fixtures are pretty dated, and the exterior could use some modern touches to boost curb appeal. With each suggestion, the tension in Jessica's shoulders increased visibly. She knew me well, enough to recognize the dangerous quiet in my responses, even if Brandon did not. These renovations sound extensive, I observed. Have you budgeted for them? Brandon waved dismissively. We'd use the equity from selling our place, the markets. Hot right now, we should clear enough for the renovations plus a nice cushion. How fortunate, I said. And may I ask what prompted this sudden interest in multi-generational living? Your colonial has twice the square footage of my ranch. The question hung in the air for a moment. Jessica studied her hands while Brandon shifted slightly, his confidence finally showing cracks. Well, to be completely transparent, there's been some restructuring at my firm, he admitted reluctantly. I'm exploring new opportunities, and during this transition period, it makes sense to consolidate our expenses. Restructuring, I repeated. So, you've been let go. Not let go, Brandon corrected quickly, his jaw tightening. I resigned ahead of organizational changes that would have limited my growth potential. I see. And these new opportunities, are they currently paying you a salary? Jessica intervened before Brandon could respond, her voice tight with anxiety. Mom, it's a complex situation. Brandon's been approached by several firms, but the right fit is worth waiting for. Meanwhile, our mortgage is, she hesitated, challenging, with just my gallery income. I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with my daughter. Jessica, are you behind on your mortgage payments? Her eyes darted to Brandon, seeking permission or guidance. The subtle dynamic spoke volumes about their relationship. We've had some temporary cash flow issues, Brandon interjected smoothly. Nothing serious, just a timing mismatch between our expenses and income. How many payments have you missed? I pressed, shifting my gaze to him. Brandon's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. That's not really relevant to… 3. Jessica interrupted, her voice small but determined. We're 3 months behind. The bank sent a notice last week about potential foreclosure proceedings. Brandon shot her a look of betrayal, but Jessica continued, words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. The property taxes increased. Again, and the Homeowners Association added a special assessment for the neighborhood entrance renovations, and then the air conditioning system failed during that heat wave in April, and you thought moving into my home would solve these problems, I finished for her. It's a logical solution, Brandon insisted, regaining his composure. We reduce our overhead, you get support and companionship, and the property gets valuable updates. Everyone wins. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden, where my summer tomatoes were just beginning to flower. For a moment, I contemplated the simplest path, telling them no and sending them on their way to face the consequences of their financial decisions. But that path wouldn't address the deeper issue. Jessica's entanglement with a man who viewed relationships as transactions and family obligations as one-directional. Before we discuss this further, I said, turning back to face them, I'd like to understand exactly what you're proposing. Would I retain ownership of the house? Of course, Brandon said quickly. We'd just cover the utilities, groceries, that sort of thing. Maybe a small rent to help with property taxes. And these renovations. Who would make the decisions about design, materials, contractors? Brandon smiled, relieved that I appeared to be considering their proposal. I've got great connections in the industry. Trust me, I know exactly what will add the most value. I'm sure you believe that, I replied. One last question. Have you considered other options? Downsizing to an apartment, perhaps, until Brandon's new opportunity materializes? Jessica looked stricken at the suggestion. Brandon's expression hardened. An apartment wouldn't be appropriate. For our lifestyle, he said dismissively. And frankly, Maggie, this solution benefits you as much as us. You're not getting any younger, and this house is a lot for one person to maintain. There it was. The condescension thinly veiled as concern. The assumption that at 56, I was essentially declining toward helplessness. The conviction that I should be grateful for their presence, regardless of the cost to my autonomy and comfort. I appreciate your concern for my advancing age, I said, my tone dry enough to parch the air between us. However, before we proceed, I think we should address your current housing situation more directly. 3 missed mortgage payments is serious. Brandon's expression darkened. We'll figure it out. I've got some leads on… On what, Brandon? More debt? Another job where you can project success while living beyond your means? Another scheme to maintain appearances regardless of the financial reality? Jessica gasped slightly at my directness. Brandon's face flushed with anger. With all due respect, Maggie, our financial management isn't really your concern. We came here to offer a mutually beneficial arrangement, not to have our choices criticized by someone who clearly doesn't understand modern financial strategies. I nearly laughed at the irony. Here was a man on the brink of foreclosure lecturing, a former military finance officer about modern financial strategies. You're right about one thing, I conceded. Your mortgage isn't my concern, at least not directly. But Jessica's well-being is, and right now, I see her trapped in a financial house of cards that's about to collapse. Jessica's eyes welled with tears. Mom, please. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone. No, I corrected gently. Brandon is trying to find a solution that preserves his lifestyle and self-image at both our expenses. There's a difference. Brandon stood abruptly, his practiced charm evaporating. This was a mistake. Let's go, Jess. Your mother clearly isn't interested in helping. Sit down, Brandon, I said, not raising my voice but infusing it with the command presence that had once silenced arguing contractors in war zones. To my mild surprise, he complied, though his jaw worked furiously. I didn't say I wouldn't help, I clarified. I said I won't let you move into my home and relegate me to the basement under the guise of helping me. There's a difference. Jessica looked up, confusion replacing some of the anxiety in her expression. Then what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we address the root problem rather than creating new ones. You're 3 months behind on your mortgage with little prospect of catching up. Brandon is between jobs with no clear timeline for new employment. Your first step should be to contact your mortgage holder and discuss options. Brandon scoffed. You think we haven't tried? Eastern Seaboard Mortgage is a corporate machine. They don't care about individual circumstances. I allowed myself a small smile. Actually, I think you might find them more reasonable than you expect. In fact, I have a contact there who might be willing to help. A contact, Jessica repeated, hope flickering across her features. Like someone who could restructure our loan? Something like that, I acknowledged. But before I make that call, I need to be clear. This isn't about saving the Colonial. It's about getting you both on stable financial footing, which may require significant lifestyle changes. Brandon's expression soured further. We're not interested in downgrading our living situation. The Colonial is appropriate for our professional standing. Your professional standing, I repeated slowly. Brandon, you're unemployed and facing foreclosure. I'm not sure what standing you believe you're maintaining, but from where I sit, it appears to be an expensive illusion. Jessica flinched at my bluntness. Brandon's face reddened further. Mom, please, Jessica pleaded. We're trying. Are you? I asked gently. Or are you trying to maintain appearances regardless of the cost? Because from what I've observed, your primary concern seems to be preserving a lifestyle you haven't earned rather than building a sustainable future. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Brandon stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Jessica looked caught between loyalty to her husband and the dawning recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, their approach had been fundamentally flawed. I didn't invite you here to lecture you, I said finally, softening my tone. But I won't participate in a plan that simply delays the inevitable while diminishing my quality of life. So you won't help, Brandon concluded bitterly. I didn't say that, I corrected. I said I won't surrender my home. Those are different statements. Jessica looked up, her expression a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. What are you saying? Mom? I considered my next words carefully. The portfolio Tom had prepared sat in my safe, containing options and leverage I could deploy. But the moment called for restraint rather than revelation. I'm saying that I'm willing to help you navigate this situation, but not under the terms Brandon has proposed. I suggest you both take some time to consider what you truly need versus what you want to maintain. When you're ready for that conversation, I'll be here. Brandon stood again, this time with finality. Let's go, Jess. This is a waste of time. Jessica hesitated, clearly torn. Brandon, maybe we should listen to what? More criticism of our choices? More lectures about living within our means from someone who's never aspired to anything beyond this? He gestured dismissively at my modest living room. I remained seated, keeping my expression neutral despite the insult. Jessica, the choice is yours. But understand that the conversation about your mortgage situation needs to happen soon. Foreclosure proceedings move quickly once initiated. My daughter looked at her husband, then back to me, paralyzed by indecision. Brandon moved toward the door, his expectation clear. She would follow as she always did. After a moment of palpable tension, Jessica stood. I'll call you tomorrow, Mom. Maybe we can talk more then. I nodded, disappointment settling in my chest like a cold weight. My door is always open to you, Jess. Remember that. After they left, the house seemed unusually quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the interaction. Brandon's reaction had been predictable: anger, dismissal, retreat. Jessica's less so. For the first time, I'd seen cracks in her unwavering support of her husband's decisions, small but significant fractures in the united front they typically presented. It wasn't the outcome I'd prepared for with Tom's portfolio of documents. I hadn't revealed my ownership stake in Eastern Seaboard Mortgage or leveraged that information to force a resolution. But sometimes in tactical situations, patience yielded better results than immediate action. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Now I needed to allow them time to germinate. My phone pinged with a text from Jessica. "I'm sorry about how that went. Brandon's just stressed about everything. Can we talk tomorrow? Just us? A small victory, but significant." "Of course," I replied. "Come for lunch. 1 p.m. The response came quickly. "Brandon has a networking event. Can we make it breakfast? 9 a.m.? Translating from Jessica speak. She wanted to meet without Brandon's knowledge. Another crack in the facade. "AM works. I'll make your favorite blueberry pancakes." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared before her final message came through. "Thanks, Mom, for everything." I set the phone down, my resolve strengthening. The confrontation I'd prepared for hadn't materialized today, but a different opportunity had presented itself. A chance to reconnect with my daughter away from Brandon's influence. And in military strategy, an unexpected opening often led to the most decisive victories. Sunday morning arrived with a gentle rain that pattered against the kitchen windows as I prepared breakfast. I'd risen earlier than necessary, a habit ingrained from decades of military schedules, and used the extra time to gather my thoughts. The blueberry pancake batter waited in a ceramic bowl, Jessica's childhood favorite, made from Robert's mother's recipe. Coffee brewed in the French press, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. At precisely 8:57 a.m., headlights swept across my front window. Jessica was early, another departure from her usual behavior. Since marrying Brandon, who considered punctuality beneath his station, she'd adopted his habit of arriving fashionably late to everything. I watched through the window as she sat, in her idling car for nearly a minute, hands gripping the steering wheel, lips moving in what appeared to be private rehearsal. Whatever she planned to say, she was practicing it first. Not a promising sign. When she finally emerged from the vehicle, she moved with uncharacteristic hesitation, shoulders hunched against the drizzle though she held an umbrella. She'd dressed casually in jeans and a simple sweater, clothes I hadn't seen her wear in years. The designer bags and carefully coordinated accessories that had become her uniform were notably absent. I opened the door before she knocked. "Perfect timing, the coffee's just finished brewing." Jessica stepped inside, shaking raindrops from her umbrella. "It smells amazing in here." She inhaled deeply, some of the tension visibly leaving her body. "Like when I was a kid and you'd make Sunday breakfast." "Some traditions are worth maintaining," I replied, leading her to the kitchen. "Have a seat. Everything's almost ready." Jessica settled at the kitchen table, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with an almost wistful expression. The old oak table with its visible water rings from countless family meals. The collection of mismatched mugs, each with its own story. The hand-painted ceramic jar where I kept wooden spoons, a gift from Jessica after her high school pottery class. I placed a steaming mug of coffee before her. "Still take it with cream, no sugar?" She nodded, looking faintly surprised that I remembered. "Thanks, Mom." I busied myself at the stove, pouring batter onto the hot griddle in practiced motions. The familiar routine gave me space to observe Jessica without obvious scrutiny. Dark circles shadowed her eyes despite careful makeup application. Her cuticles were ragged, a nervous habit from childhood that she'd apparently resumed. Most tellingly, she'd lost weight, Her cheekbones stood out sharply beneath skin that had a dull, papery quality no expensive skincare routine could disguise. "Did you sleep?" I asked casually, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. Jessica's attempt at a laugh emerged more like a sigh. "Not really. Brandon came home late from drinks with former colleagues. He was upset. About our conversation yesterday?" She nodded, staring into her coffee. "He thinks you don't understand our vision, that you're stuck in an outdated mindset about finances and lifestyle." I slid a plate of golden pancakes in front of her, topped with fresh blueberries and a drizzle of maple syrup. "And what do you think, Jess?" Her fork hovered over the plate, trembling slightly before she set it down untouched. "I don't know anymore. That's the truth." Everything made sense when Brandon explained it. Investing in our image, leveraging assets, positioning ourselves for advancement. But now, I prompted gently, taking the seat across from her. "Now, we're 3 months behind on a mortgage we can barely afford when both of us are employed. The credit cards are maxed out, the property taxes are overdue, and Brandon's solutions all involve spending more money we don't have or—" She hesitated. "Or imposing on you." "Imposing is a polite term for what he proposed," I noted, keeping my tone mild. Jessica's eyes finally met mine, shimmering with unshed tears. "He says the basement would make a perfectly good apartment for you, that at your age you don't need so much space, that we'd be doing you a favor by taking over the maintenance and updating everything." "And you believed that?" I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "I wanted to," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the alternative is admitting we've built our entire life on a foundation that doesn't exist." I explained Jessica's visit, her furtive behavior, and the disturbing phone interaction I'd witnessed. "This isn't just about money anymore, Tom. I'm concerned about my daughter's well-being." "Understood," he replied gravely. "I'll have preliminary information by this evening, more detailed reports within 48 hours. "Thank you," I said, then hesitated. "Tom, if I were to assume temporary management of their mortgage situation through Eastern Seaboard, what would be the most discreet approach?" "You're thinking of foreclosure as leverage," he surmised. "I'm considering all options," I corrected, "including allowing natural consequences to unfold." After ending the call, I spent the morning in my garden despite the light rain, finding clarity in the methodical tasks of weeding and pruning. Physical activity had always helped me process complex problems, and the current situation qualified as among the most complex personal challenges I'd faced since Robert's death. By early afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the garden refreshed and my thoughts similarly clarified. I had just finished washing the soil from my hands when the doorbell rang, an unexpected sound on a Sunday afternoon. Through the peephole, I saw Brandon standing on my porch, alone, wearing what I recognized as his negotiation outfit, a blue blazer over a crisp button-down, no tie, expensive loafers. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture confident, his expression set in what he probably thought was his most charming smile. I considered not answering. But avoidance had never been my approach to confrontation, not in military service and not in personal matters. I opened the door part way, one hand remaining on the knob. "Brandon, this is unexpected." His smile widened, showing teeth that had clearly benefited from cosmetic dentistry. "Maggie, hope I'm not interrupting your Sunday." Jessica mentioned she stopped by this morning for a quick chat, and I realized I left things in an awkward place yesterday. Thought I'd swing by to clear the air. The lie was transparent. Jessica had explicitly stated he didn't know about her visit. More concerning was the implication. He'd extracted this information from her somehow, despite her reluctance to share it. "Did Jessica tell you what we discussed?" I asked, not returning his smile. Brandon's expression flickered briefly, before resettling into practiced affability. "Just that you two caught up over breakfast. Mother-daughter stuff." He shifted his weight, clearly expecting to be invited inside. When no invitation came, he continued, "Anyway, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize I might have come on too strong about the housing situation. Professional habit? Sometimes I get so focused on solutions that I forget the personal elements." "The personal elements," I repeated, maintaining my position in the doorway. "Like, the fact that you proposed I move into my basement so you could take over my home." His smile tightened fractionally. "That's not exactly— Look, could I come in? This would be easier to discuss comfortably." I considered my options. Refusing would postpone the inevitable confrontation, while allowing him in would give me an opportunity to assess his tactics firsthand. In military operations, understanding your opponent's approach often proved more valuable than avoiding engagement altogether. "Briefly," I conceded, stepping back to allow him entry. "I have plans later this afternoon." Brandon stepped inside, immediately scanning the living room with the same evaluative gaze he'd employed the day before. I deliberately led him to the kitchen rather than the more formal living room, choosing the terrain of this confrontation carefully. The kitchen, with its practical layout and familiar comforts, was my strongest ground in this house. "Coffee?" I offered, not because I wanted to extend hospitality, but because the routine would give me time to observe him more carefully. "That would be great," he replied, settling uninvited at the kitchen table. "In Robert's chair," I noted with internal disapproval. I busied myself with the coffee maker, watching Brandon from the corner of my eye as he examined the kitchen with poorly concealed judgment. His gaze lingered on the older appliances, the well-used countertops, the practical organization that prioritized function over fashion. "Jessica mentioned you made her favorite pancakes," he commented. "She's always had a sweet tooth." "I've been trying to get her on a cleaner diet. Less processed sugar, more protein. Her energy levels have really improved." The casual way he positioned himself as the authority on my daughter's health did not escape my notice. "Jessica has always known what foods work best for her body," I replied mildly, placing a mug of coffee before him. "She's quite capable of making her own dietary choices." Brandon's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Of course. I just like to look out for her well-being. Speaking of which, that's partly why I'm here." I took the seat across from him, deliberately leaving my own coffee untouched. "Is it?" "Absolutely," he assured me, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "Jessica was pretty upset after our visit yesterday. She worries about you, Maggie." "We both do. This house, while charming, requires significant maintenance. The yard work alone must be challenging for someone—" He hesitated, clearly searching for a diplomatic phrase. "Someone my age?" I supplied, my tone deliberately neutral. Brandon nodded, apparently relieved I'd provided the term. "Exactly. At your stage of life, you should be focusing on comfort and security, not home repairs and lawn care." "My stage of life," I repeated thoughtfully. "Brandon, how old do you think I am?" He blinked, momentarily thrown by the direct question. "Well, I know you had Jessica fairly young, early 30s, I believe, so you must be—" He calculated. Quickly, mid to late 60s? "I'm 56, I stated flatly. Hardly at the stage of life where basic home maintenance exceeds my capabilities." Brandon recovered quickly, taking a sip of coffee to mask his discomfiture. "Age is just a number. Of course, it's more about quality of life. Wouldn't you rather spend your time traveling or pursuing hobbies instead of dealing with home ownership responsibilities?" The presumption was breathtaking. He'd aged me by a decade to justify relegating me to the basement of my own home, all under the guise of concern for my quality of life. "My quality of life is excellent, thank you," I replied. "But let's set aside the discussion of my needs, which I assure you I'm fully capable of identifying and addressing myself. Why are you really here, Brandon?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the practiced charm slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. Then, with visible effort, he reset his expression to one of open concern. "Jessica mentioned you two discussed our temporary financial challenges this morning," he admitted, confirming my suspicion that he'd pressured this information from her. "I wanted to follow up personally, professional to professional. I believe there's a mutually beneficial arrangement we could structure." "Professional to professional," I echoed. "Interesting framing, given that you're currently unemployed." Brandon's jaw tightened momentarily before he forced another smile. "Between opportunities," he corrected. "And that's precisely why timing is so crucial. We're facing a short-term liquidity issue while I position myself for a significant career advancement. With your help bridging that gap, we'd be able to stabilize quickly and would be in a position to reciprocate your support in the very near future." I studied him across the table, noting the subtle signs of strain beneath his polished exterior, the slight tightness around his eyes, the barely perceptible tension in his shoulders, the way his right thumb absently worried the expensive watch on his left wrist, a nervous tell I'd observed previously. "What exactly are you asking for, Brandon?" He leaned forward, voice dropping into what I recognized as his confidential register. "We need approximately $50,000 to bring our mortgage current and address some related obligations. I know that sounds substantial, but I'm prepared to offer collateral, perhaps a formal stake in our property once we're back on solid footing." The same amount Jessica had mentioned, though his framing was entirely different, not a desperate measure but a strategic transaction between equals, and the collateral he offered was laughable. How could he offer a stake in a property that was 3 months from foreclosure? "And if I decline?" I asked, curious how he would respond to direct rejection. Brandon's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Well, that would be your prerogative, of course, though I would hope our family connection would make this an easy decision. After all, this affects Jessica's security and future as well." There it was, the thinly veiled manipulation, using my love for my daughter as leverage. In that moment, my decision crystallized with absolute clarity. "You know, Brandon," I said conversationally, "one thing my military career taught me was the importance of understanding the complete strategic picture before deploying resources. Before committing $50,000 to your situation, I'd need a comprehensive assessment of your financial status, employment prospects, and credit obligations." His expression brightened, sensing a potential opening. "Absolutely. I'm an open book. I can have my financial advisor prepare a summary." "That won't be necessary," I interrupted calmly. "I prefer to conduct my own due diligence." Brandon's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." "It's quite simple," I explained, rising from the table in a clear signal that our conversation was concluding. "I'll need to review your credit reports, banking records, investment accounts, and the complete documentation of your mortgage situation, including the original application materials and all correspondence with your lender." His face had drained of color. "That's an invasive level of personal information. Surely as family," I cut in firmly. "I would expect complete transparency if you're asking me to commit significant resources to your situation. Anything less would be irresponsible on my part." Brandon stood as well, abandoning the half-finished coffee. "I'll discuss this with Jessica and get back to you," he said stiffly, the charm entirely evaporated from his demeanor. "You do that," I replied, already walking toward the front door. "In the meantime, I suggest you contact Eastern Seaboard Mortgage directly to discuss your options. Foreclosure proceedings can move quickly once initiated." He paused at the door, studying me with narrowed eyes. "You seem remarkably well informed about our specific situation." "I understand financial distress when I see it," I answered simply. It was part of my military specialty. After Brandon left, I immediately called Tom again. "I need everything we discussed expedited," I said without preamble. "And I want to move forward with establishing direct oversight of their mortgage through Eastern Seaboard." The situation is deteriorating more rapidly than I anticipated. What happened? Tom asked, concern evident in his voice. Brandon just left my house after attempting to manipulate me into providing emergency funds. His approach confirmed every suspicion I've had about his character and his treatment of Jessica. Tom's voice turned grim. I've already received preliminary information from my contacts. Brandon wasn't downsized or restructured out of his position. He was terminated for cause, specifically misrepresenting client commitments to inflate his commission structure. The information was disturbing but not surprising. Can you verify that independently? Documentation would be useful. Already. Working on it, Tom assured me. But Maggie, there's something else you should know. The original mortgage application for their Colonial contains several significant discrepancies. Brandon's stated income appears to have been substantially inflated, and there are indications that some of the supporting documentation may have been altered. A cold certainty settled over me. Mortgage fraud. Potentially, Tom confirmed. I need to gather more evidence before making that determination conclusively. Do it, I instructed. And Tom, I want to convene an emergency meeting of Eastern Seaboard's Executive Committee tomorrow morning. It's time I took a more active role in the company's operations. The plan that had been forming in my mind since Jessica's morning visit was now crystallized into a clear course of action. Brandon had made a critical error in his assessment of me, one that many had made throughout my career. He saw a middle-aged woman living modestly and assumed limited resources, limited influence, and limited resolve. He was about to discover just how profoundly he had miscalculated. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that follows decisive action. I rose at 5:30 a.m., completed my usual morning routine, then dressed with particular care in what Robert had called my corporate armor, a precisely tailored charcoal suit, modest pearl earrings, and low heels that balanced professionalism with comfort. The outfit had served me well during budget negotiations with defense contractors who invariably underestimated the woman across the table until she demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of their profit margins down to the decimal point. By 6:45 a.m., I was in my car heading toward Eastern Seaboard Mortgage Holdings headquarters in downtown Providence. The early hour ensured light traffic, giving me time to mentally rehearse the upcoming confrontation. The executive committee meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., an emergency convening that had raised eyebrows among board members accustomed to my hands-off approach to my controlling interest in the company. Since acquiring Eastern Seaboard during the financial crisis, I had maintained a deliberately low profile. My initial investment had been substantial but carefully structured through a series of holding companies that obscured individual ownership. The strategy had served multiple purposes. It shielded my personal assets from potential liabilities, maintained my privacy, and, perhaps most importantly, allowed me to observe the company's operations without the distorting influence that comes when employees know they're working directly for the owner. For over a decade, I had attended quarterly board meetings, reviewed financial statements, and provided strategic input while allowing the professional management team to handle day-to-day operations. Most mid-level employees had no idea who I was. Even some executives believed I was simply a representative of the majority shareholder rather than the principal herself. Today, that carefully maintained anonymity would end, at least within the company's leadership circle. The circumstances demanded direct intervention. I arrived at Eastern Seaboard's offices at 7:30 a.m., nodding to the security guard who recognized me from my infrequent visits, but clearly didn't understand my actual position. "Good morning, Ms. Sullivan. You're in early today." "Important meeting," I replied simply, accepting the visitor badge he extended, another small deception that would soon be unnecessary. The executive floor was quiet, with only a few early arrivals preparing for the day. Alicia Chen, the company's chief operating officer and one of the few people aware of my true role, met, Me at the elevator. "This is unexpected," she said without preamble, falling into step beside me. "The board is confused about the emergency meeting. Lawrence is particularly agitated. He had to cancel a golf game with potential investors." Lawrence Mercer was Eastern Seaboard's CEO, a capable if somewhat pompous executive who had been with the company since before my acquisition. He'd initially resisted the reorganization I'd implemented during the financial crisis, but had eventually recognized the wisdom of my approach when Eastern Seaboard remained stable while competitors collapsed. "Lawrence's golf schedule is the least of my concerns today," I replied, following Alicia toward the boardroom. "I need access to a specific mortgage file before the meeting begins. Miller, Brandon, and Jessica, property in Brookfield Estates." Alicia raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. "I'll have it pulled immediately. Digital copy or physical file?" "Both, if possible, and I'll need privacy to review it." She nodded, gesturing toward a small conference room adjacent to the boardroom. "Use this space. I'll have everything sent directly to you and make sure you're not disturbed." "Thank you, Alicia. And one more thing. I'd like James Reynolds from the compliance department to join today's meeting." Her second eyebrow rose to join the first. "Compliance? This is getting more interesting by the minute." "Indeed," I agreed, offering no further explanation as I entered the conference room and closed the door behind me. Within 10 minutes, Alicia had delivered a tablet containing the digital mortgage file and a thick folder of physical documents. I began reviewing them methodically, comparing the information with the preliminary findings Tom had provided the previous day. Brandon and Jessica's mortgage application, submitted 3 years prior, painted a troubling picture. Brandon had listed his annual income as $245,000, a significant inflation of his actual compensation, according to the employment verification Tom had obtained. More concerning were the supporting documents, bank statements showing substantial balances in accounts that, according to Tom's investigation, had been opened shortly before the application and closed immediately after approval. The pattern was consistent with a practice known as velocity banking, temporarily shifting funds between accounts to create the appearance of greater financial stability. Not technically illegal in all circumstances, but certainly misleading when used to secure mortgage approval that would otherwise be denied. I continued through the file, noting each discrepancy and potential misrepresentation. By the time I'd completed my review, it was clear that Brandon had engaged in systematic deception to obtain the mortgage. Whether his actions constituted criminal fraud would require legal determination, but the ethical violation was undeniable. At precisely 11:55 a.m., Alicia knocked softly on the conference room door. "Everyone's assembled in the boardroom. Lawrence is practically vibrating with curiosity." I gathered the physical file and tablet, straightening my jacket as I stood. "Then let's not keep him waiting any longer." The Eastern Seaboard boardroom embodied corporate understatement: polished mahogany table, comfortable but not ostentatious chairs, discreet technology integrated seamlessly into the decor. Around the table sat the 7 members of the executive committee, along with James Reynolds from compliance, who looked distinctly uncomfortable at his unexpected inclusion. Lawrence Mercer rose as I entered, his expression a careful blend of deference and irritation. "Margaret, good morning. We've adjusted our schedules to accommodate this emergency meeting, though we're still unclear about its purpose." "Thank you for your flexibility," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table, a position I rarely occupied during routine meetings. "I apologize for the disruption, but circumstances require immediate attention." I opened the mortgage file on the table before me, noting how all eyes tracked the movement. "I've called this meeting to address a specific mortgage situation that has implications for our compliance protocols and potentially our regulatory standing." Lawrence frowned slightly. "A single mortgage? Surely that could be handled through normal channels rather than requiring the entire executive committee." "Under ordinary circumstances, yes," I agreed. "However, This particular case involves potential mortgage fraud and, more significantly, a conflict of interest that necessitates my direct involvement. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as board members exchanged glances. Alicia, seated to my right, maintained a neutral expression, though I detected a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The mortgage in question was issued to Brandon and Jessica Miller 3 years ago for a property in Brookfield Estates, I continued. Upon review, there are substantial discrepancies between the financial information provided during application and the borrower's actual circumstances. James Reynolds leaned forward, professional interest overcoming his initial discomfort. What kind of discrepancies are we talking about? I slid the tablet toward him. Income inflation of approximately 40%. Asset verification that appears to have been manipulated through temporary account transfers. Employment history that omits significant gaps. Reynolds scrolled through the documentation, his frown deepening. This is concerning. How did this come to your attention, Ms. Sullivan? The question brought me to the crux of the matter. I took a measured breath, aware that my next statement would permanently alter my relationship with Eastern Seaboard's management team. Jessica Miller is my daughter, I stated evenly. Her husband Brandon has engaged in this deception without her knowledge, and the resulting financial situation has created significant distress in their household. They are currently 3 months delinquent and facing imminent foreclosure. The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock around the table. Lawrence's expression shifted from irritation to alarm, while other board members straightened in their seats, suddenly understanding the true purpose of this unusual meeting. I want to be absolutely clear, I continued into the silence. I am not here to seek preferential treatment or to circumvent our established protocols. Quite the opposite. I've disclosed this relationship to ensure complete transparency as we determine the appropriate response. Reynolds cleared his throat. From a compliance perspective, this creates a complex situation. The potential fraud is serious enough to warrant investigation, but your relationship to the borrowers creates a clear conflict of interest. Precisely why I've brought this to the full executive committee rather than addressing it unilaterally, I acknowledged. I'm formally recusing myself from any decisions regarding enforcement actions or potential accommodations. My role today is disclosure, not direction. Lawrence, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. Margaret, I appreciate your transparency, but I'm struggling to understand the urgency. Mortgage delinquencies, even those with application, irregularities, follow standard protocols. Why convene an emergency meeting? I met his gaze directly. Because I intend to take a more active role in Eastern Seaboard's operations going forward, beginning with a complete audit of our mortgage approval processes. If this situation escaped our compliance mechanisms, it raises questions about other potential vulnerabilities. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about one problematic mortgage, it was about governance and oversight throughout the organization. Lawrence paled slightly, recognizing the shift in our long-established dynamic. I've maintained a deliberately, hands-off approach to daily operations, I continued, addressing the entire committee. That arrangement has worked well during periods of stability. However, with regulatory scrutiny increasing across the industry and our own expansion plans for the coming year, more direct engagement from the ownership level is warranted. Alicia, ever the pragmatist, redirected the conversation to immediate concerns. Regarding the Miller mortgage specifically, what outcome are you seeking, Margaret? Setting aside the relationship aspect, what would you consider an appropriate resolution? It was a fair question, one I had wrestled with throughout the previous night. The conflict between my roles as Eastern Seaboard's principal owner and Jessica's mother created competing obligations that had no simple resolution. From a business perspective, the appropriate response to discovered fraud would typically involve foreclosure proceedings, potential legal action to recover damages, and referral to regulatory authorities, I said slowly. From a personal perspective, Those actions would devastate my daughter, who appears to have been kept in the dark about her husband's deceptions. A difficult position, Alicia acknowledged with genuine sympathy. Indeed. Which is why I won't be making that determination, I replied. I'm requesting that the executive committee, minus my participation, evaluate the case on its merits and determine the appropriate course of action. Whatever you decide, I will accept. Lawrence looked skeptical. You're giving us complete authority to decide on foreclosure proceedings against your daughter's home. Yes, I confirmed, with two conditions. First, that your decision be based solely on business considerations and established company protocols, neither harsher nor more lenient because of the relationship. Second, that I be permitted to deliver whatever decision you reach personally rather than through standard notification channels. Reynolds, who had been examining the file with increasing concern, looked up. Based on my preliminary review, there are clear grounds for foreclosure and potentially for criminal referral. The intentional nature of these misrepresentations appears systematic rather than accidental. His assessment aligned with my own, though hearing it stated so clinically sent a pang through my chest. For all my military discipline and financial acumen, I was still a mother contemplating actions that would upend my daughter's life. Thank you for your candor, James, I said, maintaining my professional composure through practiced discipline. I'll leave you to deliberate without my presence. Alicia has my contact information for when you've reached a decision. I gathered my materials and stood, signaling my recusal from the discussion. As I reached the door, Lawrence called after me. Margaret, one question before you go. Why now? If you've suspected irregularities in your son-in-law's finances, why bring this forward at this particular moment? It was a perceptive query that cut to the heart of my personal motivation. I turned back to face the committee, weighing how much of my private circumstances to reveal in this professional setting. Recent interactions have made it clear that Brandon Miller operates with consistent disregard for others' boundaries and well-being. His financial deceptions appear to be part of a broader pattern of manipulative behavior that has affected my daughter's happiness and security. I can no longer remain passive in the face of that reality. With that uncharacteristically personal statement, I left the boardroom, closing the door firmly behind me. The next 3 hours passed with excruciating slowness as I worked from a small office Alicia had arranged for my use. I reviewed quarterly projections, responded to emails, and attempted to focus on routine business matters while the executive committee deliberated my daughter's fate. At precisely 11:43 a.m., my phone buzzed. With a text from Alicia, decision reached, committee adjourned. I'm heading to your office now. When she arrived moments later, her expression revealed nothing. She closed the door before speaking. The committee has made its determination based on the evidence presented and our established protocols for situations involving fraudulent applications, she began formally. And, I prompted when she paused, foreclosure proceedings will continue as scheduled, she stated. Additionally, the committee has authorized a full internal investigation of the application process to identify how these misrepresentations escape detection. James Reynolds will oversee the investigation with external counsel to ensure independence. I nodded slowly, having expected this outcome but still feeling its weight. And the matter of potential criminal referral? That decision has been deferred, pending the internal investigation's findings and consultation with regulatory counsel. The committee felt that rushing to external authorities without fully understanding our own compliance failures would be premature. It was a reasonable approach that balanced business necessity with appropriate caution. I would have made the same decision in their position. The committee also instructed me to inform you that this determination was reached unanimously and without consideration of your personal connection to the borrowers, Alicia added. Lawrence wanted me to emphasize that point specifically. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. Please convey my thanks to the committee for their professionalism. In handling this unusual situation, Alicia hesitated, her formal demeanor softening slightly. Margaret, speaking personally rather than as COO, are you all right with this outcome? It can't be easy, regardless of the circumstances. The question caught me off guard. In my professional life, colleagues rarely inquired about my emotional state, perhaps because I so seldom revealed it. Alicia and I had worked together for years, maintaining a relationship based on mutual respect rather than personal connection. It's necessary, if not easy, I acknowledged, allowing a glimpse of the conflict beneath my composed exterior. Sometimes the kindest long-term action feels cruel in the moment, she nodded, seeming to understand more than I had explicitly stated. The committee also recognized your request to handle communication personally. The formal notices won't be sent until you give the word. Thank you. I'll need the official documentation to present when I meet with them. Of course. I'll have everything prepared by end of day. She paused at the door. Good luck, Margaret. For whatever it's worth, I think your daughter is fortunate to have a mother willing to face these difficult truths directly. After Alicia left, I sat alone in the borrowed office, confronting the reality of what would come next. The foreclosure would proceed, as it should based on the facts of the case. Brandon's deception would be exposed, along with the precarious financial situation he had created and concealed. Jessica would face the loss of her home and the shattering of whatever illusions she still maintained about her husband's character and capabilities. And I would be the messenger delivering this harsh reality, not as an Eastern Seaboard executive, but as a mother who had set these consequences in motion. The weight of this dual role settled heavily on my shoulders. Military leadership had taught me that sometimes the most compassionate command decisions appear cruel in the moment. Protecting. The many sometimes require difficult choices that hurt individuals in the short term. But those situations had clear chains of command and defined objectives. This messy intersection of business ethics and family loyalty offered no such clarity. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Tom. I've been monitoring the situation at Eastern Seaboard through my contacts, he said without preamble. The executive committee meeting has created quite a stir. Lawrence Mercer has scheduled meetings with all department heads for tomorrow morning. That's to be expected, I replied. I essentially announced a significant change in my involvement with company operations. They're mobilizing to adapt. And the Miller mortgage situation? Proceeding to foreclosure as protocoled, I confirmed. The committee made its decision without my input, which was precisely what I requested. Tom was silent for a moment. That can't have been easy to hear, Maggie, regardless of how appropriate the decision might be. It wasn't, I admitted, but it was necessary. What's your next move? I considered the question carefully. The foreclosure notification gave Jessica and Brandon 14 days to bring their account current before formal proceedings would begin. Given Brandon's unemployment and their maxed-out credit, paying the arrears was impossible without external assistance. My original plan had been to use this leverage to force a reckoning, to confront Brandon with his deceptions, and perhaps compel Jessica to recognize the unsustainability of their situation. But after witnessing Jessica's fearful response to Brandon's text the previous day, I had concerns about how he might react to such a confrontation. Financial pressure often exacerbated controlling behaviors in relationships already marked by manipulation. I need to speak with Jessica alone, I decided. Before formal notification, before Brandon can spin this into another manipulation, she deserves to understand the full situation before it implodes publicly. Agreed, Tom said. But getting her away from Brandon long enough for that conversation might be challenging, based on what you've observed of their dynamics. He was right. Brandon had already demonstrated his monitoring of Jessica's whereabouts and communications. A direct invitation from me would likely trigger his suspicions after our confrontational weekend interactions. I need a pretext, I mused. Something Brandon wouldn't question or want to participate in. A medical appointment, perhaps? Tom suggested. something routine that wouldn't raise alarm but would justify privacy. The idea had merit, but it needed refinement. Brandon might insist on accompanying Jessica to a doctor's appointment out of faux concern, especially if he suspected my involvement. Not medical, I decided. Something Brandon would find tedious and beneath his professional stature. Something that plays to his prejudices. A memory surfaced from Jessica's wedding planning. Brandon's dismissive reaction when he discovered the botanical garden venue came with a military discount. His thinly veiled disdain for what he considered institutional or budget options. "The Veterans Affairs Office," I said, the plan crystallizing. "I'll contact Jessica about accompanying me to submit some routine paperwork related to my military benefits. Brandon would find it bureaucratic and beneath his attention." "That could work," Tom agreed. "But you'll need to ensure he doesn't intercept the communication." Another complication. Based on Jessica's behavior during the breakfast visit, it seemed likely that Brandon monitored her phone communications. A text or call might be seen and questioned. The art gallery, I realized suddenly. Jessica still works part-time at the Hamilton Gallery downtown. I could go there during her shift tomorrow, make the request in person where Brandon can't intercept. "Solid approach," Tom confirmed. "And I should have the complete documentation package from Eastern Seaboard by then. I'll have copies delivered to your house tomorrow morning." "Perfect. And Tom," "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. This isn't the kind of situation covered in military leadership training." "That's what friends are for, Maggie," he replied simply. "Not everything fits into a field manual, even one as comprehensive as yours." After ending the call, I spent another hour at Eastern Seaboard, formally briefing Lawrence on my intentions for increased involvement in operations and outlining the comprehensive audit I planned to implement. His initial wariness gradually transformed into cautious enthusiasm as he recognized the opportunities my more active engagement might create for the company's expansion plans. By late afternoon, I was back in my car heading home, the official foreclosure documentation secure in my briefcase. The paperwork represented both business necessity and personal heartbreak, a contradiction I was still struggling to reconcile. As I drove, I rehearsed different approaches to the conversation with Jessica, trying to find the language that would convey the gravity of the situation without triggering defensive retreat. She needed to understand that the foreclosure wasn't a punishment, but a consequence, one that might ultimately free her from a relationship built on deception and control. But finding that language proved elusive. Every opening I formulated sounded either too harsh or too apologetic. The straightforward approach that had served me well in military and business communications seemed inadequate for this painful maternal duty. Perhaps there were no perfect words for such an imperfect situation. Perhaps the only path forward was honesty delivered with love, painful truth that might ultimately lead to healing. The internal struggle between my roles as Eastern Seaboard's controlling owner and Jessica's mother continued as I pulled into my driveway. The weight of dual responsibilities sat heavily on my shoulders, but the necessity of action remained clear. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful revelations, but also, perhaps, the first steps toward authentic resolution. For Jessica's sake, and for my own, I could no longer remain passive in the face of Brandon's manipulations. The time for strategic intervention had arrived. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, mystery, and discovery, don't miss our upcoming stories exploring other forgotten treasures and the extraordinary people who find them. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when we release our next video. An exploration of forgotten World War II bunkers discovered beneath a coastal vacation home, containing historical artifacts that rewrote local history. Remember to share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have reported the discovery immediately or taken Sarah's more measured approach? What lost historical treasures might be waiting in your own community? Every subscription helps us continue bringing these remarkable true stories to light. Until next time, Keep exploring the extraordinary histories hidden in ordinary places. You never know what might be waiting just beneath the surface.